Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to this very special integrity talk on enhancing water and sanitation regulation with and for integrity. This is a joint webinar between the Water Integrity Network and the Eastern and Southern Africa Water and Sanitation Regulators Association, ESAWAS. My name is Kelly Acuña, and I lead the program for Latin America and for regulators from WIN side, and I'm glad to be your moderator for today's Integrity Talk. As you were already informed, this talk will be recorded, and thank you for your permissions for that. Today, we will have interpretation throughout the webinar from English to Spanish and from Spanish to English as well. So I will be speaking in English and some of our panelists will be presenting in Spanish while others will be presenting in English. If the conversation is running in Spanish and you want to follow in English, please click on the interpretation symbol, a kind of glove in the meeting controls, which you will find at the bottom right-hand corner of your screens, and select your preferred language channel. So before we move on to the other housekeeping details, let me welcome our colleagues from the Latin American region. Buenos días para todos y para todas. Bienvenidos a esta Integrity Talk, donde conversaremos especialmente sobre cómo mejorar la regulación del agua y el saneamiento con y para la integridad. Este es un webinar organizado conjuntamente entre la Red de Integridad del Agua, WIN, y la Asociación de Reguladores de Agua y Saneamiento de África Oriental y Meridional, ESAWAS. Mi nombre es Kelly Acuña, soy líder de programas para América Latina y para los reguladores de WIN, y me complace ser su moderadora en la charla de integridad de hoy. Como ya saben, esta charla será grabada. Gracias por su consentimiento para hacerlo. Hoy contaremos con interpretación durante todo el webinar y de ahora en adelante voy a estar hablando en inglés y algunos de nuestros panelistas presentarán en español, mientras que otros lo harán en inglés. Si quieren seguir la conversación en español, por favor hagan clic en el símbolo de interpretación, una especie de globo, en los controles de la reunión y seleccionen el canal de idioma de su preferencia. Okay, so a couple of housekeeping details before we begin. First, we ask you to keep yourself muted, both participants and panelists, when you are not speaking. We encourage you to put your questions and ideas in the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom right-hand corner of your screens. Please also introduce yourselves in the webinar chat so we know who is participating today and where are you coming from. And that's all for housekeeping. It is again a pleasure to welcome you all to this session on enhancing water and sanitation regulation with and for integrity. In this integrity talk, we will discuss how regulators drive accountability and transparency within their own organizations and the key role that the regulators play in fostering a culture of integrity in the whole sector, ultimately creating a resilient framework that ensures the delivery of equitable water and sanitation services for all. So regulators stand as key enablers of integrity, operating at this crucial interface between policymakers, service providers, and users. They are tasked with setting the rules, establishing mechanisms for compliance, and enforcing processes to ensure that other stakeholders' mandates are fulfilled and standards are enforced. This very complex role places them in an environment with potential for integrity failures and opportunities for corruption. Yet they bear this responsibility to regulate with integrity and for integrity. This requires a commitment to transparency and accountability in their own conduct, what we call regulating with integrity, as well as in the design and implementation of regulations, understood as regulating for integrity. In our last flagship report, the Water Integrity Global Outlook on Water and Sanitation Financing, we present practical solutions for regulators to address corruption and integrity failures, ensuring that every dollar invested in the sector counts. So that being said, we have several panelists for today's agenda. First, we will start with a keynote presentation by engineer Robert Gacubia, Robert is board member of WIN and former CEO of the Water Services Regulatory Board, WASREP, in Kenya. Robert will touch on the dual scope of regulators in improving internal processes and fostering integrity across the sector. He will also be sharing the specific case of WASREP that he knows well. In the second part of our session, we will have an interesting panel with 4 of our colleagues with a ground-based perspective from Latin America and the Eastern and Southern Africa region. It is a pleasure to give a warm welcome to Mr. Jose Kobachikawa, Director of the Audit Authority of SUNAS, the National Superintendency of Sanitation Services of Peru, to Mr. Diego Polania, former Executive Director of CRA, the Water and Sanitation Regulatory Entity of Colombia, to Ms. Yvonne Magawa, Executive Secretary from ESAWAS, and finally to Ms. Shola Bilima, Senior Financial and Commercial Inspector from NABASCO, the National Water Supply and Sanitation Council from Zambia. Afterwards, at the end of our session, we will have time to answer the questions of today's audience. So please feel free to share your questions and ideas in the Q&A box throughout the session, and we will be happy to gather them and ask our panelists to answer them at the end of the session. So that being said, I would like to pass the word to Robert. Welcome, Robert, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the remarks in the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good day all. As per the introduction, my name is Robert Kakubia. I am a supervisory board member of Water Integrity Network, and I've been a regulator before I retired 3 years ago. Now, because of time, I started my presentation with age-old wisdom. Age-old wisdom is about when you start, you must say what you are talking about, what it means. But I will request that we pass that in terms of definitions and go straight to how we operationalize integrity. And operationalizing integrity is really operationalizing the principles of transparency, accountability, participation, and anti-corruption, because that is the integrity framework we are talking about. These are the core principles that guide good and effective regulation. And this is what underpins, these are the values that underpins our regulation. As you know, as many of us may know, without that pillar of values when you are regulating, I think your regulation will kind of be weak in a way, because despite having all the legal mandates and authority you have and having all the resources, you need some values to guide you. In other words, what are the operating principles that guide you in your operations as a regulator? This is the reason I think we focus on integrity, or regulating with integrity and for integrity. Next slide, please. And the next one. That is basically the what underpins regulation in terms of values. I prefer sometimes to talk about virtues, because then that is a closer link to integrity, because integrity finally ends up with talking about our character and our behaviors as we do whatever we do. Next slide, please. Now, the focus on integrity is trying to get us away from, we have been talking about corruption. Corruption, which many people become very sensitive when you talk about it, but with integrity is broader. Integrity opens your mind to any other issues that may not necessarily demonstrate themselves quantitatively, because corruption, we try to focus on figures that are mentioned. But when it comes to integrity, there are many other issues that may not manifest themselves in terms of figures, but are very important in the whole chain of trying to improve regulation and trying to regulate with integrity. So it goes beyond corruption and ensures that responsible institutions act honestly, they act fairly, transparently, accountably, and diligently. And in that case, when you talk about corruption, is really a symptom of failing integrity. And that means, to emphasize my earlier point, integrity can fail in many areas, in many fronts. Strengthening integrity, therefore, builds trust and confidence with our institutions, especially the regulatory institutions we are talking about here. and even the service provider level, and you might also be lucky that it can actually impact on how government does its business, because you're actually within that nexus of government, service providers, and consumers. So to maintain integrity, we need to ask ourselves, or we constantly ask ourselves, whether we are performing our functions well, and if not, what can we do to ensure functions are performed well? And I think this is a responsibility for regulators in the water service sector, and that is where now regulations comes in. Next slide, please. So regulators basically interpret and implement the legal and policy framework, because the country has aspirations, has objectives, policy objectives that they want to meet in the water services sector. So regulators are essentially the policy implementers. They ensure that, and therefore they must drive the integrity of the policy implementation process. There's a quote there from the OECD, just to demonstrate how regulation is gaining prominence in the whole area of public service delivery. Regulators do this by establishing a set of regulatory tools, and these tools help implement, they monitor, they also kind of bring out they also enforce if it doesn't happen, and they incentivize an enabling environment to ensure equity, enhance equitable access to water and sanitation services by reducing inequalities and also encouraging ethical behavior. This lays a very strong foundation for sustainable services. The tools basically operationalize that integrity framework we are talking about. So that is, for you to regulate with integrity, you must operationalize the tools that demonstrate that transparency, demonstrate accountability in the sector, and demonstrate and also facilitate participation for people to actually have a way in which they can actually talk about what they think about the service, what their experiences are, and all that. But in doing this, we consider regulators as part of an integrity system. Therefore, they must themselves demonstrate internal integrity through a set of values which they must build. And I think to paraphrase this, I want to say that regulators themselves must model. They must model themselves in this framework. That is, when you look at a regulator, you actually get encouraged and you see integrity in the whole process. And you model yourself by actually demonstrating those values of professionalism, in terms of the way you handle your resources, in terms of the team that you actually put together to regulate the sector, in terms of the process of fairness, and also responsiveness to the needs of the sector and also needs of the consumers. This actually makes public policies more efficient and effective, and it also enhances the regulator's legitimacy. So focusing on these days, I want to say that I think focusing on more rules, stricter compliance is fine, tougher enforcement is fine. But I think that has been found to be limited in terms of effectiveness. And I think that is why we are more and more, we are talking about fostering public integrity in delivery of public services. And therefore, a regulator should foster integrity within their system and actually be the model that the actors would likely to see in terms of what they are demanding of them. Next slide, please. So in the case of a regulator in Kenya, just to talk about quite a bit about what the regulator in Kenya has been doing. Perhaps it's good to start by saying that every country has a reason for establishing regulation. So in the case of Kenya, I think the driving force behind establishment of a regulation were issues to do with equity, issues to do with sector efficiency, issues to do with accountability, and viability of the sector. Instead of talking about sustainability, which was too wide, we talk about viability of service provision within water service provision. That is what was driving it. And that is why you see that in the time the regulator was being established, there was already a policy objective, for example, of improving efficiency in service provision, as demonstrated by non-revenue water levels, which we even had a policy objective. But that was also as a proxy for mismanagement of the sector. So the regulation was introduced to at least try to make sure that you improve the management of the sector to deliver the policy objectives. Even in selection of the indicators that were agreed on, they were grouped in three categories. There was operational sustainability because the sector had to continue delivering despite the other challenges. There was a quality of service that had kind of was very low, and there was also economic efficiency. If you look at the indicators around operational sustainability, next slide, please. They had to do with the non-revenue water, and that is really about avoiding wasted investments. And talking about wasted investments is really the integrity of the infrastructure delivery chain. There was so much losses within the infrastructure delivery chain that the investments were not delivering as per their capacity and as they were designed. The issue of the staff issue was really to kind of try to address the political patronage that was happening, and political patronage was also affecting competencies. These are all integrity failures. And then the metering ratio was in terms of data integrity. As we are aware, if you are talking about accountability, you really must have data. Data is really sometimes, I think, referred to as a raw material for accountability. So if you are already managing a service that is not able to actually monitor itself, then there is already a problem. The quality of service was about how you are serving people in terms of to avoid no issues to do with cherry picking. It is very easy to kind of ignore people who live in formal settlements, for example. Yet they also have a right. There should be equality in order to receive the services. It's very easy to just focus in terms of reliability on people who are at policy level who can influence policies and all that. And it is very easy to kind of ignore water quality because you suppress any reports of water safety and all that, and you are not able even to assess risks. In terms of economic efficiency, is the next slide, that is. Next slide, please. In terms of economic efficiency, is about collecting what you are owed. I mean, you are billing people every month or whatever time you are billing, and you are not collecting the bills. The cost is about covering the cost and also understanding the relationship with the price and the price and the quality of service. This also speaks to the integrity within along the infrastructure value chain. You must ensure that whatever tariffs you are charging people, they are linked to investments. And this I must say is one of the challenges we have here in Kenya. Personnel expenses as percentage of operation and maintenance. Personnel are not, water service providers or utilities are not employment bureaus. So you must really employ people that know that they will be delivering. But added to that, as the regulator grew in the next slide, there were also other indicators of trying still to address problems of integrity and problems of service delivery. There were governance sub-indicators. There was the issue of trying to align with the SDG kind of tagline of leaving no one behind. In that case, you must have a conscious effort to address the low-income consumers. We are also looking at the creditworthiness index in terms of still trying to make sure that the data we are using is more credible and validated. So we monitor through sector benchmarks, and I've noted a few points there. If you are out of the benchmarks, and I did not ask you to move very far, you just look at the mirror. That didn't mean that as we do this, there are no challenges. And I highlight a few challenges in the next slide. There's a few challenges that actually the regulator has been facing. And all these, if you look at them, you can, without necessarily just talking about them one by one, you can align with the current topical subject in the water sector. In the water sector, the current topical subject, at least which I hear in almost every conference, every meeting, to whether international or local, the current topical issue is about system strengthening. System strengthening has to do with all what we are talking about. And system strengthening basically comes down to the fact that we are the solution, and we are the problem, and we are the solution. And when it comes to us, it's really about focusing on integrity. You cannot, it's not about, for example, talking about from kind of an abstract way. Regulators implement through the tools, they have recommended and they have prepared tools and all that. In other words, they set the rules of the game. But focusing on integrity means that there are issues in the play of the game. That is where we focus on. And if you look at all this, it's really about the play of the game. So to conclude, because I realized there was very little time. I want to say that this transformative change we are always talking about in the water sector and perhaps even in other sectors is about improving our socioeconomic conditions through, and this in the water services sector can be done through an independent, transparent, and accountable regulation. And for this to happen, we must embed integrity in our development process. It's about basically who we are as human beings and the virtues as opposed to values. I'm focusing so much on virtues because these really have an identity criterion if you are talking about virtues. And that is really what we have developed at the personal level. So for me, the parting shot I would say, which is in the last slide, is really about that people are the root of this problem in water services. People are also at the center of the solution. So I reaffirmed human responsibility is the most natural barrier to all this irresponsibility. That's a quote from I think this gentleman from is it from Czech Republic or somewhere in Europe somewhere. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thanks for sharing your presentation and this interesting progress that WASREP has been doing on understanding how the KPIs implemented are indeed related with integrity. Also, thanks for sharing the remaining challenges around coordination, capacity, and transparency. I'm sure there's still a long way to go, but we can already see a lot of improvement. We encourage our audience to put questions in the Q&A box. I'm sure Robert will be happy to answer to the questions from the audience at the end of the session.
Definitely, yeah.
Now it is time for the second part of our session, the panel with 4 of our colleagues. In the first part, Jose and Diego will be presenting with a focus on how integrity should start from within, with clearly defined roles and responsibilities, with independency wherever possible, and through the implementation of robust accountability mechanisms. Let's start immediately with Jose from SUNAS in Peru. Bienvenido, Jose. Recuerda que tienes 5 minutos para tu presentación.
Buenos días, ¿me escuchan bien?
Sí, te escuchamos.
Buenos días, soy José Kobashikawa, director de la Dirección de Fiscalización de la SUNAS, y voy a comentarles un poco respecto a las funciones que tiene la SUNAS y las acciones que tenemos respecto al tema de integridad. Si me ayudan con las láminas, por favor. Comentarles que SUNAS es uno de los 4 organismos del Perú, que tenemos en el Perú, que se encuentra adscrito a la Presidencia del Consejo de Ministros. Es un organismo público que es técnico, es especializado, cuenta con autonomía administrativa, funcional, técnica, económica y financiera, ¿no? Por otro lado, tenemos a otros reguladores como CITEL, que ve telecomunicaciones, o SINERMIN, que ve el tema de energía y minería, y OCITRAN, que ve el tema de transporte, ¿no? Y SUNAS, el tema de agua potable y saneamiento. La siguiente. A través de nuestra competencia, la SUNAS fue creada en el año 92 y han habido varias modificaciones normativas. La última de ellas es el Decreto Legislativo 280 en el año 2016, ¿no? Que es la Ley de Servicio Universal, donde se establece que la SUNAS, en su condición de organismo regulador, le corresponde garantizar a los usuarios la prestación de los servicios de agua potable y saneamiento en el ámbito urbano y rural, en condiciones de calidad y confiabilidad, contribuyendo a la salud de la población y también al medio ambiente. La siguiente, por favor. En cuanto a las funciones de SUNAS, tenemos funciones reguladoras, es decir, se fijan las tarifas a las empresas prestadoras, normativa, para todo ellos emiten disposiciones y tiene un marco legal, la función fiscalizadora para justamente verificar que esas condiciones de servicio se den de acuerdo a las normas y disposiciones legales que se den. la sancionadora también, si es que producto de la fiscalización se verifica que no se cumplen con ciertas disposiciones, la disolución de reclamos entre usuarios y el prestador, y también la determinación del área de la prestación para buscar una eficiencia en la prestación de los servicios, ¿no? Entonces, como les decía, hay un ámbito de intervención urbano, que son las empresas prestadores, donde las localidades tienen mayor de 15.000 habitantes, pequeñas ciudades, que son localidades también urbanas, pero que tienen un rango de población entre 2.001 habitantes y 15.000 habitantes, y un ámbito rural, que son prestados por organizaciones comunales, que son localidades de menos de 2.000 habitantes. La siguiente lámina, por favor. Entonces, en atención a las atribuciones y funciones asignadas a las UNAS, esta entidad se alinea a la lucha contra la corrupción como un mandato constitucional, ¿no? Hay todo un marco legal ya del Estado, pues constituye uno de los problemas más corrosivos de nuestro tiempo, en nuestra sociedad, malgasta recursos públicos, amplía las desigualdades económicas y sociales, alimenta el descontento y a la polarización política, y también reduce sobre todo la confianza de la población hacia las instituciones, ¿no? Entonces, en ese sentido, en SUNAS trabajamos con unos pilares que son el respeto, la vocación de servicio, la probidad y la veracidad. La siguiente. Entonces, en cumplimiento de este marco normativo que tenemos en el Estado peruano, como parte de la Política Nacional de Integridad y la lucha contra la corrupción, a fin de garantizar la prevención y sanción efectiva de la corrupción a nivel nacional, se ha establecido contar con un oficial de integridad, ¿no? Este cargo le corresponde al gerente general de la SUNAS. ¿Qué funciones tiene? Promover, ¿no? Y asegurar el desarrollo de estrategias de integridad, garantizar el cumplimiento de las funciones de integridad y también brindar asesoramiento para que este modelo de integridad se difunda en toda la institución. La siguiente. Entonces, acá contamos con un equipo de integridad en la SUNAS, se ha constituido un grupo, ¿no? Que está conformado por un coordinador y cuenta con un analista en integridad, un analista en control interno y un analista legal. Entonces, todo este equipo, en el marco del modelo de integridad de la entidad, eh, tiene ciertas funciones, ¿no? Como la conducir la gestión de riesgos, proponer y supervisar el programa de integridad, coordinar e implementar capacitaciones sobre integridad justamente a todos los profesionales y servidores de la entidad, y recibir, evaluar y derivar denuncias sobre supuestos actos de corrupción, ¿no? Acá tenemos una línea, tenemos un correo en el cual se pueden recibir denuncias y poder ser canalizados adecuadamente. Y también tenemos una matriz de riesgo justamente que nos permite identificar qué actividades de la entidad de las UNAS pueden estar propensas a temas de corrupción o temas de soborno, ¿no? Para poder mitigar y tomar acciones al respecto. La siguiente. Ahora, en el caso del sistema integrado de gestión, en SUNAS contamos con un sistema de gestión integrado que tiene tres pilares fundamentales, ¿no? La parte de calidad, la parte de seguridad de la información, pero tenemos el sistema de gestión antisoborno, que es el ISO 37001, ¿no? Que está relativo a justamente la gestión institucional eficaz y con integridad, ¿no? Para esto tenemos un oficial de cumplimiento que recae directamente en nuestro presidente ejecutivo, que es la máxima autoridad de la entidad. La siguiente, creo que esa es esta sería la última. ¿Y cuál es la política del sistema integrado? ¿Y qué compromisos asumimos? Es prohibir todo acto de soborno, ¿no? Eso conlleva pues a no recibir incluso regalos o de repente algún obsequio que te puedan dar algunas empresas reguladas, ¿no? Establecer canales de denuncias para actos de soborno, es decir, que en la entidad se sepa ante un indicio de soborno dónde y cómo analizarlo, ¿no? Y garantizar la autoridad e independencia de responsable de la función de cumplimiento para asegurar la correcta implementación de este sistema de gestión antisoborno. La siguiente. Bueno, muchas gracias por su atención.
Muchas gracias, José, a ti por compartir acerca de las funciones y responsabilidades de la SUNAS como regulador económico. Esa claridad en los mandatos institucionales del regulador puede ser visto como el primer paso para construir un regulador que actúa con integridad y que, como bien lo dijo Robert, modela la integridad en el sector. Es también interesante ver que existe toda una estructura funcional dentro de la institución enfocada en proponer y supervisar un programa de integridad y de lucha contra la corrupción. Esto también es precisamente ese ejemplo o modelo que quisiéramos ver reflejado en todo el sector. Now I would like to pass the word to Diego Polanía. Diego is the former executive director of CRA in Colombia. Bienvenido, Diego. La palabra es tuya.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Un gusto, soy Diego Coranía, ex comisionado y ex director ejecutivo de la CRA, experto en agua, digamos, y estoy muy contento y muy agradecido con Win por haberme invitado a esta presentación. Voy a hacer una presentación corta alrededor del tema a tratar, eh, y ya tenemos espacio como de reflexionar sobre lo mismo. Por favor, me confirman si están viendo mi pantalla.
Aún no, Diego.
Y ahora sí, creo. ¿Listo?
Dame un segundo. Ya, ahora sí.
Bueno, pues digamos que el punto es cómo desde la regulación se puede impulsar procesos de rendición de cuentas que incentiven transparencia y fomenten una cultura de integridad en el sector de agua. Ahí es clave entender que los reguladores juegan un papel fundamental en la promoción de buenas prácticas. Y hay algo fundamental en el ejercicio de la regulación, es la confianza. Un regulador solamente está haciendo bien su tarea si transmite confianza. El regulador en últimas juega un papel de, por decirlo así, de árbitro entre diferentes instancias, prestadores, gobierno, usuarios, y solamente si es una entidad confiable, ese ejercicio se puede llevar bien. Para eso es indispensable entender la necesidad de procesos que garanticen la rendición de cuentas y la transparencia interna de esos reguladores. Es decir, es muy importante la confianza hacia afuera, pero esa confianza solo se logra cuando se generan procesos sólidos al interior que garanticen tomas de decisiones balanceadas e insesgadas. Y eso tiene una cantidad digamos así, de condicionantes, que es un poco lo que quiero tocar acá. Lo primero, pues como le estaba diciendo, solamente si el regulador es un regulador que transmite confianza y que se califica como un regulador confiable, puede hacer bien su ejercicio. Y en ese contexto, solamente si opera bajo principios de eficiencia, calidad y sostenibilidad con transparencia, se puede pensar que ese regulador está haciendo bien la tarea. Eh, la idea de esto en un sector como el de agua y saneamiento, que es absolutamente vital, que afecte directamente a la salud pública, el bienestar. Solamente si hay transparencia se puede hacer que eso funcione bien, y en ese sentido solamente cuando hay un proceso de rendición de cuentas y de publicación y publicidad de las decisiones y de los argumentos y los motivos por los que se toman las decisiones, se puede dar un desarrollo integral en términos de los sectores y de los buenos resultados. Para esto, pues existen una serie de mecanismos internos, y yo pues no estoy haciendo una referencia explícita a la CRA por mi condición de exfuncionario, aunque todo esto sale un poco del ejercicio del regulador colombiano, pero es más un alcance general en el que hay ciertos mecanismos de rendición de cuentas en los reguladores que necesariamente se tienen que adoptar para ser más transparentes. Por ejemplo, lo mencionaba el colega de SUNAS, una claridad en la estructura de gobernanza. Solamente cuando hay una claridad en las funciones, llamémoslo así, en el marco interno y organizacional de las instituciones y en cómo se toman las decisiones, puede haber transparencia. Entonces, no solamente se trata de tener muy claros los roles y las competencias, sino los mismos flujos organizacionales para la toma de una decisión. Para eso son muy importantes los sistemas, como lo mencionaba también nuestro colega de SUNAS, los sistemas de planeación, los sistemas de control interno, en los que paso a paso está documentado y reglado y se guardan soportes de todos los motivos que llevan a la toma de una decisión. Y es muy importante entender que en la regulación las tomas de decisiones son decisiones discutidas y debatidas, colegiadas. Digamos, es el caso específico de la Comisión de Regulación de Agua en Colombia, en donde las decisiones se toman por votación en una serie de espacios en los que participan miembros del gobierno y miembros independientes técnicos para al final poder llegar a una decisión. Y eso también implica, esa toma de decisión colegiada aleja un poco llamémoslo así, el fantasma de la corrupción o de la no transparencia, porque al final de cuentas las decisiones se toman de manera colectiva y no hay una sola persona tomando una decisión. Además de todos esta serie de estructuras internas y organizaciones bien definidas, pues es muy importante tener visiones externas. Entonces, en ese sentido, todo el llamado de auditorías internas y externas eh, para revisar desde el momento en que se plantean los problemas que se quieren resolver y todo el procedimiento para resolverlo es fundamental. Digamos que la forma en que la información sea clara, transparente y se pueda evaluar de manera externa y de manera interna, hace que, por un lado, todo el proceso esté blindado, todo el proceso sea claro y que las decisiones al final estén protegidas por esta lógica de necesidad de argumentos y pruebas, tomar decisiones basadas en evidencia y en información, más que en tomar decisiones, por decirlo de alguna manera, unilateralmente y sin mucho soporte. Toda digamos, la construcción y la existencia de sistemas de seguimiento y evaluación, otra vez, internos y externos, hacen que todo el proceso pueda ser mucho más efectivo y mucho más transparentes. En la medida que haya necesidad o que haya obligatoriedad de publicar resultados, de hacer seguimiento a los resultados y de tener toda una cadena de valor que es la que lleva los indicadores de resultados con indicadores intermedios, con responsables, con tareas y con registros, posibilita esa tarea. Entonces, en la medida que yo hago un seguimiento estricto del proceso, que tiene al final un producto, un outcome, un resultado final, pero que no me quedo solo allá al final, sino que tengo claramente una cadena de valor construida para llegar hasta allá, es una forma importante de generar todo el proceso de transparencia y otra vez de alejar malas prácticas. La transparencia en la toma de decisiones que se basa mucho en que haya un proceso formal y público para la creación de la regulación, es decir, que no, salvo casos muy excepcionales, se me ocurre la pandemia, en los que los tiempos de la toma de decisiones fueron mucho más rápidos y los procesos tuvieron que apurarse, usualmente llevar un proceso claro, que consulte a los interesados, que tenga muchos espacios de retroalimentación, que además la retroalimentación tenga que registrarse, que las observaciones tengan que contestarse y que al final cualquier decisión que se tome esté motivada, es la única forma de garantizar que todo ese andamiaje administrativo lleva a decisiones informadas y a decisiones transparentes. Nuevamente, y ha sido insistente en mi intervención, la posibilidad de hacer esto, hay muchas entidades que lo hacen de manera muy correcta internamente, pero que no lo muestran hacia afuera. Encontrar caminos para poder abrir esa información y tener consultas y tener ejercicios externos, control externo, es fundamental. Tener acceso a la información pública, pues publicar la información, pero además tener acceso a información pública garantiza tener procesos más informados, pero además ser más claros en la información que le transmito al regulado y a los usuarios, otra vez garantizando mi rol en ese triángulo en el que yo tengo que ser un regulador confiable para poder hacer bien un ejercicio intertemporal. Hacer informes periódicos de desempeño, mostrar resultados, mostrar objetivos, mostrar metas y mostrar procesos. Es muy importante hacer esto y hacerlo además de manera de manera clara y simple, encontrar los mejores mecanismos para transmitir esa gestión es importante, porque hay que entender que muchas veces hay que entender el auditorio al que se está refiriendo. Entonces, el lenguaje sea muy sencillo y entender que se está transmitiendo mensajes que son de interés público. Tener espacios de consulta pública reglados, abiertos, tantos como sea necesario. Y nuevamente, ya lo dije, pero es fundamental, recoger las observaciones y comprometerse a contestarlas. Que quien hace una observación tenga claro si al final su observación fue aceptada o no y por qué en la toma de decisiones regulatorias. Y finalmente, algo que va más hacia lo externo, que es como todo el ejercicio de sanciones y recompensas, de incentivos, multas para el buen comportamiento. Buscar cómo ese tipo de esquemas pueden de alguna manera reflejarse al interior, y tener equipos que son incentivados en las buenas prácticas, y por el contrario que existen claramente, también como lo decía nuestro colega, es unas prohibiciones y sanciones a cualquier mal práctica. Todo esto pues evidentemente genera cierta resistencia al cambio. Para muchos es más fácil, aún sin mala intención, digamos, es más fácil encerrarse en una oficina a tomar decisiones. Pero aunque eso sea más fácil y más rápido, con seguridad es menos eficiente, porque solamente cuando las decisiones son tomadas de manera transparente y pública, son internalizadas y generan resultados. Y superar limitaciones tecnológicas y de recursos. Para lograr hacer este ejercicio de manera transparente es muy importante, como lo dije, tener sistemas, tener plataformas, tener espacios en donde se puede reflejar todo ese esfuerzo, nuevamente para generar confianza externa. Digamos que con eso creo que ese será todo. Como conclusión, pues el impacto de la transparencia y la rendición de cuentas, que necesariamente es el que garantiza una mejor toma de decisiones. Eso se traslada en beneficios a los usuarios, y necesariamente un regulador tiene que generar todos los procesos para que esa transparencia sea parte casi que de su ADN, de su lógica de operación, y así ser un regulador confiable y transparente al que el mercado reacciona de manera positiva frente a sus decisiones. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti, Diego, por acompañarnos en esta discusión, por tus reflexiones sobre cómo los reguladores pueden operar de manera efectiva en ese marco de relaciones de rendición de cuenta entre los responsables políticos, pero en este triángulo con proveedores de servicios y usuarios. Interesante ese énfasis que haces en los procesos que deben ser transparentes y participativos, porque al final son la base que garantiza que las decisiones que toma el regulador sean eficientes, equitativas y que sean sostenibles en el tiempo, ¿verdad? En la medida en que el mercado y los operadores de servicio las entienden, si no siempre las comparten, pero entienden que hay detrás todo un proceso transparente y participativo en su creación. Muchas gracias. And so now I would like to pass the word to Mrs. Yvonne Magawa, Executive Secretary from ESAWAS, our co-host for today's Integrity Talk, and an important partner for the work that WIN does in strengthening integrity in the water and sanitation sector in the African region. Yvonne and then Shola will focus their presentations on regulating for integrity, on how regulators should work towards enabling integrity in the sector by holding service providers accountable and by putting in place requirements on transparency of information, stakeholder participation, and anti-corruption as well. Welcome, Yvonne. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It's our pleasure to be co-hosting this Integrity Talk with WIN. And thank you to the previous speakers. The presentation from Engineer Kakupia was very insightful, and the use of the KPIs to illustrate how integrity works in the sector. Next slides. I'll be focusing for integrity. But just to give you a brief highlight, what ESAWAS is a association of water supply and sanitation regulators, primarily from the Eastern Southern African region, but now we have a continental focus and we are looking at the African continent at large. Next slide. When we talk about regulation, we understand regulation probably differently depending on where we come from, because different countries have got different approaches to regulation. So we conducted a study a few years ago on what the regulatory framework looks like across the continent. And we recognize that countries actually have mixed regulatory arrangements. So responsibilities are usually split among several actors, and this tends to constrain effective regulation. But the major part of the findings was that regulation by agency itself is actually the one benefiting from the strongest legal backing and good sector performance for both water supply and sanitation. So as an association, we look at how to support effective regulation in countries. And that being our focus, we look at different aspects to do with guidance, tools, instruments that are required for effective regulation. So my presentation focuses on how ESAWAS is supporting the countries in these different areas to ensure that there is that advancement of regulation. Next slide. So one of the things, so the principles of regulation are the same. So this is what is allowing us to be able to use that basis to support different countries, regardless of the type of regulation that is being used. So one of the things that we're working on is to ensure that countries have comprehensive and coherent regulatory frameworks. This is very key for accountability mechanisms. So ESAWAS is basically supporting the development of frameworks that outline the clear roles and responsibilities of actors in the sector. We've done this for the sanitation regulation framework, and we are also developing one for rural regulation. Tariff setting, very key for accountability as well, and also inculcating transparency in the sector in how decisions are made with regards to tariff. So as ESAWAS, we are supporting the autonomy of regulators in tariff determination decisions, and also trying to enhance the role of the regulator in the financing framework. What is the level of transparency with investments that are allocated to the sector? Knowing also that investments are scarce. So where does the regulator find its fit within that framework to ensure that resources are actually ending up in the right place and they are benefiting everyone at the end of the day without leaving any particular section behind? This includes proper considerations, looking at informal settlements and so on, and also ensuring that there's sustainability of services. So trying to meet that balancing. So as ESAWAS, we are supporting this side with the development of guidance with regards to tariff setting for both sanitation and water supply. Then we also support the development of regulatory mechanisms. These are tools and instruments that have universal access considerations. So trying to incorporate the informal settlements, trying to ensure that the quality of services is actually improving over time, and there is a way to hold service providers accountable for what they are delivering. And also to ensure that social inclusion aspects are not left out at the end of the day. So these regulatory mechanisms really focus on trying to ensure that every person has access to quality and affordable services without compromise. Next slide. The other aspects that we are focusing on is improving the effectiveness of the regulator themselves. This is compliance reporting and enforcement. So we are investing a lot in technical trainings for regulators in aspects of inspections, as Diego was highlighting, ensuring that certain principles and ethics are upheld within the regulators, aspects of enforcement to ensure that the issues that are set out by the regulators as principles or as mechanisms for delivering service in the sector are actually upheld, and somebody is answerable at the end of the day. If it's not being done, there must be a consequence for non-compliance. And what is that consequence? That is the regulatory role. So the regulator itself has boundaries within which they must operate. So we need to be able to support the regulators to ensure that they are actually capacitated to discharge their mandates, but within recognized boundaries. Then we are also supporting sector tracking and reporting. As has just been mentioned in the previous presentations, it is not just about publishing information, but also having access to that information. So sector tracking and reporting is a key mandate of regulators, and it also helps to close gaps for decision-making. So being able to monitor the performance of mandated entities, being able to hold them accountable to the performance, and being able to also recognize the performance and carry out public shaming. It is not enough to just do one side of the story. It must be well balanced so that the sector is able to learn and is able to know what consequences are faced by those who are underperforming, and to be able to incentivize the performers. So at the region level, we also have a regional benchmarking report that is assisting to elevate visibility of performance within the sectors, ensuring that transparency is actually brought to the continent level. So the utilities actually feel honored to be recognized at the continent level as performers. So it is our hope that using this approach, they will be able to improve the kind of data that is used for monitoring and reporting on the performance of the sector. Then the other aspect that we're supporting is engagement of the public. Regulators need to have mechanisms to be able to get feedback from consumers on the quality of service, and also to inform regulatory design. In some countries, I'm sure Chola will mention this, they have water watch groups, they have consumer groups like in Tanzania. So we need to ensure that the systems exist that enhance feedback from consumers on the quality of service. And one of the things that we are supporting is the rollout of a system for sanitation services, which is SaniTracker, that will aim to collect information on the quality of service right from the ground, from the consumers themselves, with oversight by the regulators, so that regulators know whether the quality of service standards that have been put to the service providers are actually being adhered to. Next slide. So I think that should be all from my side, if I'm not mistaken. And this is what we are doing as an association. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne, for sharing this very interesting regional perspective and the work that ESAWAS is constantly doing in encouraging and supporting regulators in establishing regulations that encourage integrity. Now I would like to pass the word to Ms. Shola Mbilima, Senior Inspector from Nabasco from Zambia. Welcome, Shola.
Thank you very much. I will go straight into my presentation. I'll focus on strengthening integrity in water and sanitation through regulation. And like it was indicated, my focus is really on how regulators can regulate for integrity. Next slide, please. Okay, so to get the ball rolling, I want to start with this African proverb that says that if you don't know who you are, anyone can name you. And if anyone can name you, then you will answer to anything. So what that simply means is that it's not by the mere fact that you are called a regulator that makes you one. You need to demonstrate some form of characteristics that are expected of a regulator for you to really be a deserving regulator. So most of us are called regulators, but are we really regulators? And I will narrow down to some of the good principles that we need to have in line with integrity. So while the slides are still changing, I'll focus on 4 principles generally. The first principle that I want to focus on is the principle of responsibility. Now, as regulators, this is very important. For you to be able to regulate for integrity, you need to make sure that issues of responsibility are well taken care of. And in making my presentation, I will be drawing examples from what we have at NWASCO, just to amplify some of these points that I'm making. So when we discuss issues of responsibility, what we basically need to ensure as regulator is that we have policies in place that basically articulate what needs to be done, who should do what, and who is responsible, like it was indicated by the previous speakers. So we need to have what gives us the mandate, the law that backs up our mandate. We need to have clear institutional arrangements that actually demonstrate who is supposed to do what, so that we are able to know who is responsible and we can hold them accountable. So responsibility is a very fundamental principle of good regulatory governance, and it also ensures that there's integrity in our regulation. So as NOASCO, as you can see, I've tried to reflect our institutional setup. We have a Ministry of Water that is overall responsible. We have the regulator, NOASCO, 2 regulators that are involved. In fact, we even have 3, but I just cited the 2. NOASCO is responsible for water supply. We have a regulator that is responsible for environmental protection. And we also have a regulator that does water resource management. So we also have very clear indication of who is providing the services, who are they answerable to, what exactly do they need to do in terms of discharging their responsibilities. So basically, regulators need to have that in place for them to be able to say that the aspect of responsibility has been taken care of. Next slide. The next principle that I would want to talk to is the principle of transparency. So transparency is also a very important principle. If a regulator has to regulate for integrity, you need to be transparent in what you're doing with the regulated. So your regulatory decisions, Robert mentioned that regulators must set up systems internally that define how they discharge their duties. Now, as you discharge those duties as a regulator, you now need to let the general public know what you are doing and how you are doing it. So in being transparent, I think regulators need to have a mechanism for publishing their decisions. Whatever decisions you make, they need to be made public and subject to scrutiny. If somebody has to challenge you, they must be free to do that. So you are not supposed to hide your decisions as a regulator. Equally, things like monitoring services of the regulated entities, that should be public information so that anybody is able to see, and even the criteria of how to do that should also be clear so that people are able to follow how it's being done and appreciate what is being put out to the general public. So again, as a matter of example, as NOASCO, we do have what we call the sector report, urban and peri-urban sector report that we've been publishing for over 20 years. And this basically shows comparative performance of the service providers that we regulate. So we regulate 11 service providers. And in this report, we show how they are performing using the benchmarks that we have established as a regulator. And to just make it easy for people to understand, we also use the color coding where green signifies that the entity is doing fine, red, they're not doing so well, and then yellow is like they're average. So basically we do publish this and it's accessible, and it's also presented to our policymakers and the legislators in Parliament for them to use for decision making. So transparency, again, a very important principle for integrity. Next slide, please. So the next principle that I will articulate is the principle of accountability. Again, as regulators, if we want to regulate for integrity, we need to make sure that we are accountable. We uphold accountability in the work that we are doing. So as an example, at NOASCO, first of all, what we have done is to have what we call service level guarantees. So, when you are dealing with services, it's difficult for one to know what they're entitled to. So if you're dealing with products, it's very easy because you can quantify them in terms of volumes and numbers, you can count them and so on. But if you are dealing with a service, sometimes it's difficult to really quantify what is expected from a service provider. So as regulators, you need to narrow down to what customers should demand for when they are being provided with these services. So what we've done as NOASCO is we've developed what we call service level guarantees, which are basically a service charter for the customers. So each customer will know that for whatever money that they are paying, the level of service that they're entitled to is articulated on that service level guarantee. And it basically assures value for money for our customers. Very important aspect. The other thing that we do is the performance ranking for the utility companies. So again, we try to show in trying to hold them accountable to what they're supposed to be doing, we rank them. So who is doing better than the other? And this basically is trying to really prop up that issue of accountability so that they are held accountable to say you are supposed to be producing so much volumes of water, or you're supposed to be giving so many hours of supply. Are you really doing it? And in comparison to the others, how have you performed and what needs to change or to improve for you to perform better? Next slide, please. The final principle that I want to speak to is the principle of participation, which is a very important principle as well. And I think I saw a few questions in the chat box where people were trying to find out more about how regulators can actually enhance participation. So most of the regulatory frameworks that we have, unfortunately, are not very strong on issues of participation, but it's a very, very important principle that regulators need to uphold. So a regulator doesn't know everything. The regulator is only as good as the feedback that they get from the beneficiary of their regulation. So regulators need to come up with mechanisms of how they are going to ensure participation in their regulatory decisions. The decisions that regulators are making in a number of aspects, you need to see how you take stock of what the consumers are saying or what they have to contribute towards that particular subject matter. So as NOASCO, what we've done is that we've tried to develop an instrument where we involve consumers in regulation. And one of the things that we've done is to create what we call water watch groups. So these are basically volunteers from the community that take care of their interests, their water and sanitation interests. So they look out on their service providers based on the service level guarantee that I mentioned. Is the provider giving the services according to what they have guaranteed? Do people have complaints? How is the service provider responding to those complaints? And they're basically holding the provider accountable and demanding value for money. And these are people that do it for no price. They are just interested in making sure that they have the services. So you can see a picture of the water watch group meeting where they're articulating issues to do with water supply and sanitation in their respective communities. The other thing that we've done is we've developed an online platform for complaints, which we call My Watson. And now we are in the era of technology, so it should be easy actually to develop tools to involve consumers. So we have tried to do that as NOASCO, and we have this My Watson complaints platform where consumers can actually interact with the regulator via the web, and we are able to interact and get their feedback on the levels of services that they are getting and what they would want to see from their service providers. We also have public consultation meetings, especially during tariff setting. So tariffs are one of those issues that are really, really sticky for consumers. So you need to involve them when you are trying to arrive at the best tariff for the utilities. So what we do is that before the utility puts up an application for a tariff, they need to involve their customers by holding public meetings with them to engage them on what they want to do in terms of revising the tariffs and what that will mean in terms of service provision. So these are some of the ways in which we actually involve our consumers and making sure that they participate. I would also take advantage and answer one question that I saw where somebody was asking how civil society can be brought on board. Again, what we do is we leverage on the strengths of different civil society organizations. So if they are good at advocacy, we tap into that strength and see how we collaborate with them to enhance that particular aspect. And in our case, We've worked with some civil society organizations to do things like lobbying and also ensuring that the utilities are also enhancing their participation in some of the decisions that are being made. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I want to summarize by saying that regulation has got 3 pillars, as most of us already know. So the first pillar is the governance, where we need to ensure that there's an enabling environment. And this makes it possible for us to make decisions without undue influence. And this is very important for integrity, because if you are going to be influenced in your decision making, then you will not have integrity, because anyone can tell you what to do and you're going to do what they say. The second pillar is that of substance. This is what the first speaker was talking about, that regulators need to, within themselves, develop systems and structures of being institutions of integrity. So it speaks to the tools for regulation and the basis for the decisions that regulators are making. So within the tools that you develop for regulation, you must embed in aspects of integrity, and some of these principles that I've just mentioned must be inherent in your tools for regulation. And the final pillar is that of impact. Again, here you need to make sure that whatever you are doing, we will only be judged by the impact that people see on the ground. So all these things, at the end of the day, if we have integrity, it will end up ensuring that service is available, and these will be quality services, affordable and sustainable services. So to conclude, I would want to say that integrity is a very important aspect of regulation. Regulators cannot regulate without integrity, because the whole issue of regulation borders on issues of integrity. Thank you very much. I will end there.
Thank you, Shola, for sharing the progress of Navasco in strengthening integrity in the water and sanitation sector through regulations that encourage and somehow demand the principles of integrity. You mentioned responsibility, transparency, accountability, and participation. And let me highlight a statement you just made that I found brilliant, and is that the regulator is only as good as the feedback, the information it gets from the regulated, and I will add, from consumers. So thanks again, and to our panelists. And now we will have some time to ask some questions from the audience to each of the panelists. Thanks, because I'm seeing here that you have already answered to some of them, but we will have time now to answer them live and to answer the other ones. I will ask each one of you to be brief on your answers so we can solve as many questions as possible in these last 15-20 minutes that we have. So please don't take more than 2-3 minutes for each answer. So let's start with a question for Diego and Jorge and José, sorry. Diego, José, les preguntan que si como reguladores tuvieron ocasión de encontrarse con influencia política indebida en sus trabajos, y de ser así, ¿cómo lo afrontaron? Si quieren, empezamos con Diego y seguimos luego con José.
Listo, muchas gracias. Pues digamos, el punto es que, ¿qué definiríamos como indebido? Por la conformación de la Comisión de Regulación de Colombia, tiene en la silla, en la Junta, tiene 4 miembros de gobierno. Entonces, uno siempre, digamos, haciendo regulación en Colombia, distinto a SUNAS, seguro José ahorita, uno siempre tiene una discusión de los temas con el gobierno, y el gobierno tiene unos intereses específicos movidos por su proyecto político, digamos. Entonces, para contestar, sí hubo algunos casos en que desde el gobierno había un interés específico por un interés político de algo que en el concepto propio del regulador era inconveniente, pero nunca un tema con incentivos corruptos para tomar decisiones, sino temas, qué sé yo, tener recortes tarifarios por un interés político más que técnico. Y como decía en mi presentación, lo importante siempre es tener datos e información que corroboren el argumento que uno quiere defender, poner esos argumentos sobre la mesa y al final llegar a decisiones por votación. Siempre en mi experiencia, el resultado fue el que sugería la técnica y los datos. Pero es muy importante como ese blindaje del proceso como un todo.
Gracias, Diego. José, si tú quieres compartir algo en el mismo sentido.
Sí, bueno, en nuestro caso, en SUNAS como regulador de Perú, sí se ha tenido algunas situaciones de interferencias. Lo que se ha hecho acá desde la institución es siempre mantener la autonomía, llevarlo siempre al lado técnico, y también acudir a voces autorizadas del país, ¿no? Por ejemplo, a expertos del sector que son reconocidos, han sido autoridades o son consultores. También se ha recurrido a la academia, a universidades o a organismos cooperantes, ¿no? Que tienen una independencia y tienen experiencia a nivel internacional, justamente para acudir a ellos y que den también su punto de vista y su opinión ante este tipo de interferencias, y acudir a los medios de comunicación justamente para difundir y tener esa perspectiva, ¿no? Entonces esto ha ayudado bastante también a poder mitigar algunos intentos de interferencia en las decisiones que tiene SUNAS o incluso en la misma organización respecto a las funciones que tiene, ¿no?
Gracias, José. This is a question for all speakers. How have you, as a regulator, worked with civil society to improve integrity and accountability in regulation? And if you can give some practical examples, I think Shola already mentioned something. If anyone else want to comment on it. And related with that question, also the next one from Marcos, he mentioned also this relationship between the regulator and civil society organizations. For example, the national chapters of Transparency International around the thematic of integrity in each country. So please feel free to open the mic and answer to these questions.
Let me try to answer the second part of the question. Most of us in our countries, we have institutions that are responsible for integrity or anti-corruption. So here in Zambia, we have what we call the Anti-Corruption Commission, which is whose mandate is to ensure that there's integrity in especially public institutions. So what we've done as a regulator is that we have taken a deliberate step to work with them in developing our regulatory tools and instruments. And we've developed one guideline in particular, which is called an Anti-Corruption and Integrity Guideline, which was done jointly with the Anti-Corruption Commission. And basically, we have articulated the issues that the utilities need to follow within that guideline, which conform to their requirements as well as our requirements. And in terms of implementing that guideline, we also reserve the right to actually do it jointly. So we co-opt them into our operations when we are trying to investigate some of these corruption issues within the utilities.
Sorry, Kerry. I've mentioned a bit of that working with the Anti-Corruption Commission in the question and answer, unless somebody wants more information. But I think it's important to also note that as part of our operations as a regulator or even any other public agency, they actually have a commitment and within our performance contract with government to actually have the Anti-Corruption Commission even vet our processes and vet our team and all that, so that at least they look at the integrity issues that may be within the organization. They actually do annual surveys and all that. The government insists that they are the ones to do it, not you to report on your anti-corruption or whatever integrity issues. It is the Anti-Corruption Commission to actually give you that bill of health that you may want. But there is also what we call a public ombudsman. That one also helps you in terms of deepening your relationship with consumers in terms of their complaints. Any consumer can send any complaint to the ombudsman, and every year the regulator gets a certificate to show where they were in terms of dealing with the consumer complaints. With regard to civil society, one of the strongest values within our constitution is public participation. And this is important for the regulator because, as Chola said, regulatory decisions are always vulnerable to challenge. They are always vulnerable. So you should always be ready with your public value aspect, with your public interest aspect, and why that public reason why you are actually doing what you are doing and why you have made these certain decisions. So the major decisions by the regulator are always subject to public participation. And we still deepen with our relationship with civil society within that public participation arena and many other groups. But there is a civil society network in Kenya called KEWASNET. They actually address issues of governance. So we work together as WASREB, at least when I was there, the regulator works together with them and other institutions. For example, we have a working memorandum with the Water Integrity Network as WASREB, so that we try to at least address and face these issues, try to face these issues head on, and try to improve service delivery with integrity.
Thank you, Shola. Thank you, Robert. Moving on to a question for José. José, te preguntan de qué manera puede contagiar o incluir la adopción de esquemas similares a los que presentaste para SUNAS en los vigilados, en las empresas operadoras de servicios públicos y en las organizaciones comunitarias con la misma función.
En el caso de las empresas prestadoras que están en el ámbito urbano, hay un mecanismo, digamos, más, más conciso, ¿no? Que es más complejo en las organizaciones comunales. Por un lado, las empresas prestadoras han firmado una carta de compromiso que también se adhiere a nuestra política y a nuestro programa de integridad, pero es un tanto enunciativo, ¿no? Entonces, por otro lado, tenemos un esquema de buen gobierno corporativo en las empresas prestadoras, en el cual tienen una serie de aspectos que deben cumplir, es decir, deben tener procedimientos claros para, por ejemplo, elegir a sus directivos, a sus gerentes. Tienen también que hacer una audiencia pública, por ejemplo, a los usuarios, tienen que convocarlos y hacer una rendición de cuentas a los usuarios. Y bueno, por ser empresas públicas, ellos también tienen que adherirse al programa y a la política de integridad del Estado, ¿no? Entonces, SUNAS no fiscaliza exactamente el modelo de integridad, pero sí fiscaliza, por ejemplo, el tema del buen gobierno corporativo, ¿no? Que las empresas tengan su rendición de cuentas, sus audiencias públicas, y esto es monitoreado en las 50 empresas prestadoras, ¿no? En el caso de organizaciones comunales sí es más complejo, ellas digamos, se eligen directamente en audiencias públicas. Lo que se hace son una fiscalización más orientativa, no tanto fiscalizadora, en el cual se hacen recomendaciones de cómo determinar, por ejemplo, a la junta de esta organización comunal que va a administrar los servicios y qué cuota va a establecer para el pago del servicio, ¿no? Entonces, es un tanto más complejo en ese caso, pero es más concreto en el caso de las empresas.
Gracias, José. Una pregunta también para todos los expositores. Dice Javier que todos han coincidido en la importancia de la participación de la comunidad y el control social para gestionar la integridad en el sector, pero que normalmente encontramos una barrera a esto y es que por lo general no hay canales confiables y efectivos de denuncia que aseguren la protección de la identidad del denunciante. Si podrían socializarnos acerca de casos de éxito al respecto. They're asking about whistleblower channels and if you know about any experience that has been effective on that regard.
Si me permite, Kelly, en el
Adelante,
caso de
José.
Perú, de repente no podría contarles un caso concreto, pero sí comentarles que tenemos canales de atención de denuncias y también un mecanismo de protección para el denunciante, ¿no? Y la reserva del caso, justamente para poder proteger su identidad. Esto se viene realizando capacitaciones constantes dentro de la institución para que cada uno de los trabajadores de las UNAS puedan justamente contar con ese correo electrónico y ese mecanismo. Hay una persona identificada que ve estos casos para que después pase ya a investigación, ¿no? Y por otro lado, tenemos también un consejo de usuarios, ¿no? Que podemos recibir, que representa a la sociedad civil, a asociaciones de consumidores, que a través de ellos también podemos canalizar cualquier tipo de denuncia, cualquier tipo de comentario, aporte que va directamente al Consejo Directivo de SUNAS.
Gracias, José. Anyone else want to add to that one? Or we can move to the next one. Also a question for all the panelists. What actions does the regulator take if they become aware of corruption or malfeasance taking place in utilities? Do regulators work with anti-corruption bodies? That was somehow already answered, but not the first part of the question. Diego, José preguntan, ¿qué hace el regulador en el caso en que encuentra que hay casos de corrupción o malas prácticas que ocurren dentro de las instituciones prestadoras de servicios que son reguladas por el regulador?
Si me permites, yo hago un
Just to-
comentario. En el caso colombiano, digamos, por un lado, los funcionarios del regulador son funcionarios públicos y es obligación de cualquier funcionario público si tiene conocimiento de actos de corrupción, denunciarlos. Estrictamente, digamos, estamos hablando de corrupción directa, tendría que denunciarlo ante entes competentes, no tiene el regulador una capacidad sancionatoria frente a, digamos, acciones de tipo fiscal o penal. Pero si lo que encuentra es, digamos, malas prácticas en términos regulatorios que conllevan a gestiones indebidas, ahí sí tiene como todo el camino para imponer, no digamos, en Colombia hay una entidad de regulación y una entidad de supervisión. La entidad de supervisión tiene todo el aval para imponer sanciones, multas, llegar hasta intervenir la empresa y remover la junta o los accionistas. Entonces, depende del tipo de acción, pero si es del tipo de gestión pública, digamos, o de gestión regulatoria, está toda la herramienta para poder intervenir.
Gracias, Diego. Otra pregunta tenemos acá. How do regulators deal with regulation of the large number of small service providers that provide water and sanitation services in informal settlements and in rural areas in particular? José, también para ti, Chola, Ivonne, Robert, para el que quiera responder, ¿qué hacemos o qué hace el regulador para trabajar ya no con los proveedores de servicios puntuales, sino con este gran número, esta gran constelación de pequeños prestadores en las áreas periurbanas o en el área rural? Adelante, Diego.
Bueno, sí, levanté la mano por si alguien quería contestar antes por lo que estaba hablando yo ahorita, pero digamos, ese es el gran reto del caso colombiano. Digamos que la regulación en Colombia ha llevado a un buen resultado y a un equilibrio en lo que llamamos áreas consolidadas o los núcleos, pero toda esa región periurbana y todo el área rural es donde hay mayor deficiencia y donde hay menor presencia. Y además hay que tener claro que la regulación, de alguna manera la regulación es rígida, ¿no? Busca estándares, busca situaciones homogéneas. Entonces, lo que ha buscado el regulador colombiano para atender esa problemática especial es tener cierto nivel de flexibilidad y adaptabilidad a las condiciones específicas y particulares de los territorios. Implica un trabajo mucho más fuerte y cercano, individual, de entender la problemática e ir flexibilizando restricciones regulatorias. Siempre y cuando haya planificación y metas claras, casi que abrir la posibilidad de cualquier tipo de solución eh, técnica o económica que conlleve a una senda de mejora del servicio. Entonces, la respuesta, nosotros lo denominamos esquemas diferenciales. La respuesta está encaminada a una lógica más flexible y adaptativa a los problemas específicos. ¿Sí?
Gracias, Diego. Ivonne, please go ahead.
Yeah, so just very quickly, I will start from where Diego ended and talking about flexibility of regulators. I think for a long time, regulators focused on the larger service providers because they cover much wider areas and they are more formalized in the way that they provide services compared to the smaller deconcentrated service providers. They tend to be informal service providers, and they tend to work in quite a large number of informal areas as well. So in the recent past, this is changing now for the regulators as they recognize that there is a need to bring these smaller service providers under some accountability mechanism because the consumers are not protected at all. So how should that be done? And the guidance that needs to be there is something that we are working on as well as SOURs, where we are developing a framework that addresses regulation for rural areas and small water supplies as well. That will help to bring these entities under a formalized arrangement and therefore enhance transparency, enhance accountability, enhance participation of the consumers and so on. So that is the way we are approaching it, but recognizing also that regulators have been limited in terms of the capacity. They tend to be lean so that they don't pass on high costs to consumers who pay user charges for regulators. So with that recognition, it means regulators must be flexible, as Diego said, and be able to adapt and provide regulation that is simplified and suitable for different settings of service providers. Over.
Thank you, Bon. And final answer from Shola.
Regulation must be responsive. And if we are discussing integrity, one of the good practices actually of enhancing one's integrity is also to be responsive to situations and environments. So if regulators are rigid, then it compromises their ability to have integrity. And that is why when we are now looking at the small schemes that were being mentioned, we now need to look at the environment. It's a different environment. So when you go in with a rigid mechanism, it will not work. So I'll give an example of what we have in Zambia with regards to sanitation. So under sanitation, we have the utilities that are, the overall responsible, but because they can't discharge those duties by themselves, they now co-opting the small private operators that do part of the work, like the pit emptiers, the vacuum tanker operators. Now, what that means is that as a regulator, you now need to offload some of your regulatory, functions to the utility to be able to oversee their third-party, operators that they've engaged, so that the chain is adequate and it's able to ensure that the accountabilities are still there. And some of the instruments that we have, like the ones that I mentioned in my presentation, may not be valid for those small operators like the ones I've mentioned. So you then need to develop tools that will respond to these particular providers, bearing in mind that the principles are the same. It's just the mechanisms of how you get there that will differ. So I think regulators will then need to respond to the situations, bearing in mind that they still need to uphold the same principles, but using a different approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Shola, very much. And on that note, our time has come up. I would like to thank all our panelists again for this very interesting conversation. It has been a pleasure to learn from you all, from your experiences, and to see the interest there is in the water and sanitation sector to continue fostering this culture of integrity from the regulator's perspective. We will be sharing a blog post about this integrity talk, and we at WIN remain open to the conversation around integrity. So please reach out with any comment, idea, or opportunity to continue catalyzing the culture of integrity in the sector. Thank you very much and have a nice evening and rest of the day. Muchas gracias, José Diego, por su participación. Estamos en contacto con todos.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Nice seeing you.